Hi, everyone. Welcome. My name is Avi Cummings, and I'm a staff member at the Barnard Center for Research on Women. Thank you all so much for coming tonight, and thanks especially to Christina, Heatherton, and Craig Willse for taking the time to share your work and your insights with us. Thanks also to our co-sponsor, New Directions in American Studies, a new initiative at Barnard started by Christina Heatherton and Jordan Camp, who's in the audience. And thanks to the BCRW team and our many collaborators, especially the members of the newly formed but long brewing, where's Pam? Oh. Poverty and Public Housing Working Group, including Pam Phillips, Janet Jacobson, Hope Dector, Tammy Navarro, Sona Quigley, Crystal Portalatin, and Matt Harvey. Christina Heatherton is an assistant professor of American Studies here at Barnard. She's a scholar and a historian of anti-racist social movements who, in her work and teaching, is committed to accountable relationships between scholars and students and the communities in which they live and work. She is completing her first book, The Color Line and the Class Struggle, The Mexican Revolution, Internationalism, and the American Century, which I know I'm really excited to read. Christina, along with Jordan Camp, who, as I said, is also here tonight, recently edited Policing the Planet, Why the Policing Crisis Led to Black Lives Matter, and previously co-edited Freedom Now, Struggles for the Human Right to Housing in LA and Beyond. She is also the editor of Downtown Blues, a Skid Row reader. Craig Willse is the author of The Value of Homelessness, Managing Surplus Life in the United States. He is co-editor with Patricia Clough of Beyond Biopolitics, Essays on the Governance of Life and Death. Willse also works in queer trans studies in an ongoing collaboration with legal scholar Dean Spade. His scholarship is informed by his political work outside the academy, which has included community organizing around housing access, social movements for trans justice and prison abolition, and queer anarchist anti-war activism. As associate professor at George Mason University, he's a faculty advisor to GMU Students Against Israeli Apartheid. Tonight's talk is the first public event in the Poverty and Public Housing Working Group. Together, we've been working to build a shared analysis around examining and resisting the racialized, classed, gendered, and ableist logics of the neoliberal state that target the most vulnerable members of our communities for surveillance, control, precarious lives, and premature deaths, particularly Black and brown communities, Muslims, immigrants, queer and trans people, people with physical and psychiatric disabilities, people with low and no incomes, and people who are unsheltered. We are here tonight because we believe, as the title Homes for All, Cages for None so beautifully affirms, that housing is a central feature of the world we want to build, and that policing and prisons are violent, damaging, irreparable, and unredeemable systems that need to be abolished. In this political moment, we are faced with the rise of fascism and white supremacy, pervasive gentrification, over 4 decades of neoliberal disinvestment in low-income communities and communities of color, and a hyper-investment in policing these same communities. We're asking how we can fight to sustain and reinvest in housing as a public good and the true safety and wellness of our communities. It's in this context that we're thrilled to have Craig and Christina joining us tonight, because they've done critical work to help us understand these issues and take an abolitionist approach to resistance and building social systems and practices rooted in a commitment to safety and resources for everyone. Craig and Christina's work also helps us practice a critical interrogation of our tactics. Are the demands or proposed reforms on the table moving us toward the transformation we seek, or at least ameliorating current conditions on the way to that transformation? Or are they strengthening the neoliberal state, the criminal punishment system, the systemic entrenchment of racialized poverty, either by collateral consequence or by design? These are critical lessons for all of us. Finally, Craig and Christina's work and practice offers us living models for principled and accountable relationships between academia and social movements, models for the redistribution of resources and power, and working in coordination with organizers and communities on the ground. This is one of BCRW's core commitments, and we're grateful to these scholar activists who offer us models and opportunities to share them with our broader community. So on that note, thank you all again for coming, and I'm honored to turn it over to Craig and Christina.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Avi, so much for that intro. And I want to thank you for all your work making this event possible, and thank Pam Phillips and Tina Campt and everybody else at BCRW. This is like exactly the place I want to be, and this is exactly the kind of conversations I want to be a part of, so I'm really grateful for all the work making this happen. So the plan for tonight will be Christina and I are going to do a little back and forth. So Christina's going to start us off by talking some about the concept of abolition, and then I'll talk some about the concept of housing justice, and then we'll go back to Christina, who will tell us some more about her specific work. I'll talk a little bit about my own work, and then we'll open it up to Q&A with all of you. So that'll be our format, and I think I'll just go ahead and pass it over to Christina. Thank you.
Great. Hi, can everybody hear me? Okay, well, thank you all for coming out tonight. Thank you, Avi, for organizing this incredible event, and to everybody, Pam, Janet, Tina at BCRW. I want to thank Kyle, who's actually selling both Craig's book and Policing the Planet for us tonight, Jason, who's going to make sure I sound perfect on sound, and everybody else who's helping out. I really appreciate this, and like Craig said, there's no place I would rather be. I'm new to Barnard College. I don't know if you know that. And so last week someone said, oh my God, they have you in the Oval. Are you even going to be able to fill that? And I didn't know what that meant. But now I do. What a beautiful room. I really appreciate you all coming. I want to say at the outset that, as many of you probably know, there is a protest across the street at Columbia University. There is a bigoted Islamophobic speaker who will be Skyping in at 8 p.m. And I want to welcome everybody to walk with me across the street after this event concludes to participate in the protest. We'll talk a little bit about that more at the end. So as I said, I'm new to campus. I'm really delighted to have this opportunity to get to know everybody here. But even though we don't know each other, I do know one thing that characterizes everybody in this room, and that's that all our lives are deeply structured by the criminal justice system, or as I'd prefer to discuss it tonight, the carceral state. Everyone in this room has some relationship to policing in prisons, whether you were ever arrested yourself, know someone who was, or whether you ever engaged in behavior like speeding, driving without a license, maybe less relevant in New York City where nobody drives, doing drugs, drinking underage, etc. Things that could have gotten you into legal trouble but didn't. If you ever did anything illegal but never feared serious repercussions, well, then you also have a relationship with the carceral state. These, I think, are the edges of the spectrum. Some people feel relatively immune from punishment, while others live in a state of what I call imminent violability, aware that they could be picked up at any time, or to use the words of Supreme Court Justice Sonia Sotomayor, quote, subjects of a carceral state just waiting to be cataloged. So why do some people get arrested while other people do not? As I'm sure people in this room know, the reasons are determined by reasons of class, race, region, gender, by presentations of normativity, all of which shifts in different places and times. What might be totally commonplace behavior in one place and time, for example, as we'll talk about tonight, standing outside your home and talking to your neighbors, or hanging out late in a park with your friends, might become criminal behavior at another time, especially when the value of that place changes. What we see in Harlem, in Morningside Heights, is that the property value around Barnard and around Columbia continues to skyrocket. And when property values increase in New York City, so too does police presence. All over this city, whether you're talking about Crown Heights in Brooklyn, the South Bronx, or the Lower East Side of Manhattan, gentrification means increased policing. And increased policing means that people are more vulnerable to stops, searches, arrests, and violence, especially when they're from working class communities of color. This is what Craig and I will talk a little bit about today, the links between racism, criminalization, and housing, how we understand it, why it happens, and what we can do to end it. Sound good? Okay, great. So let me give you a few definitions for our conversation. For starters, what is the carceral state? If I had to ask you to quiz you, how many people think they could define it? Who knows what the carceral state is? Okay, no pop quiz. Prison abolitionists Ruth Wilson Gilmore and Craig Gilmore teach us that a state is a territorial bound set of capacities that are not determined in advance. States can do many things. They can build and repair roads and infrastructure. They can run libraries. They can provide health care, or as we'll talk a little bit about today, build housing. States can also militarize borders, build prisons, build bombs, build increasingly sophisticated mechanisms to surveil, detain, maim, and kill people. The nature of state capacities are determined politically. A carceral state, therefore, characterizes a state whose capacities are disproportionately punitive. In our country, where more money disproportionately is spent on policing prisons and permanent war than on anything else, it is safe to say that we live in a carceral state. States make decisions about managing problems. And for as long as most of you, not all of you, but most of you in this room have been alive, the US state has managed its crises through punitive solutions, namely through the buildup of policing and prisons. This is something that Jordan Camp explains in his book, Incarcerating the Crisis, and he'll be teaching a class on the topic this spring if you're interested in learning more. He and I edited a book, as Avi mentioned, called, it's on Facebook Live, you can't drop anything. All right. He and I co-edited a book called Policing the Planet that collects the thoughts of organizers, scholar activists, artists, and journalists that are confronting the carceral state. Not everybody in the book would self-identify as an abolitionist, but I think taking together they offer a range of ideas about what abolitionist principles and discussions can look like. And there's one part of the book that I really like, and I co-edited, I love the whole thing, but there's one part that I think is very interesting. There's an interview we do with organizers of a Chicago-based group called We Charge Genocide. One of the organizers is named Paige May. She's gone on to start the group Assata's Daughters, also in Chicago. And Paige had a really interesting reaction when we asked the organizers to talk about abolition. She talked about being afraid of the word. She said it sounded too extreme and too militant to her. She was really angry about police violence, but she also had a number of family members that were police officers, and she was worried about how her organizing under that term might completely alienate them. But in the process of organizing around police violence in Chicago, she learned from people like Mariam Kaba what abolition was. Abolition was not an outrageous, unrealistic provocation about simple destruction. Abolition, in the tradition of the word, meant imagining a more expansive version of freedom than the current world could ever hold, and then with every action, constantly building that world. We should remember, and I know I have 5 minutes, so I'm wrapping up, but we should remember that the movement to abolish slavery was a global internationalist freedom struggle that necessarily aligned with movements to end imperialism, colonialism, and capitalist exploitation, and it was led by enslaved people themselves. Rather than simply accepting a freer place in an unfree world, abolitionists expanded the parameters of freedom, building institutions not only for formerly enslaved Black people, but open to everybody. In his study, which I'll just have you all know, I'm new here, but in W.E.B. Du Bois's magisterial study, Black Reconstruction in America, which I think should be required reading for everybody, he describes this ethic as a form of abolitionist democracy, which means that nobody can be free in a society premised on exclusion. Guided by this principle, we learn that freedom can never be won by expanding other people's unfreedom. Our version of freedom must be global and expansive. This is what the history of abolition teaches us. So what this means for us now is that we have to think about what is possible within a carceral state, and then we have to think beyond the possible. This means recognizing how the carceral state determines some of the ways that we define our terms, like freedom, like security. This is a complicated concept, and I've been tasked, as I said, with 5 minutes to explain a lot. So when pressed for time, I think about an art project that one day I'd like to do. Maybe some of you in this room can help me. The project would feature a series of lists, very similar to the kind that my mom used to put on the refrigerator, lists of phone numbers of people, aunts, friends, relatives that we could call if something happened, if something disturbing happened, if we got lost, if we got locked out, et cetera, et cetera. And I'd like to show this kind of list shrinking over time until in the present there's just one number on that list. And what is that number? 911. One of the most deforming aspects of the carceral state is that it forces us to mediate all of our social problems through police. Anytime something upsetting or uncomfortable happens, when a student is misbehaving in school, when a person is panhandling in public, or when someone is sleeping in their car, the default solution, what we have available to us, is to call the police. Abolitionist logic asks us to think hard about what produces these problems in the first place and how we can prevent those problems from ever happening. Abolition, I just want us to remember, is built on a philosophical premise. Every negation is an affirmation of something else. Negating prisons, negating the carceral state, means affirming another way of being in the world. And our challenge is imagining together what that world will be. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Christina. I have to say, when I proposed this kind of format, it was motivated by a selfish desire to hear you do what I knew you would do, which you just did for us. Thank you. And then I realized, oh shit, that means I have to figure out what I mean by housing justice and come up with something to say for that. So it was really helpful for me getting ready for today to sort of like look back at my own scholarship and my organizing history to sort of like put that together to be like what's a framework actually to organize how I've been thinking and thinking with other people about housing. At its most basic level, for me, the concept of housing justice is the insistence that all people at all points in their lives deserve access to safe and stable housing. And that may sound quite simple, but it's actually an idea that's absent in most scholarship about housing and unfortunately in a lot of approaches to dealing with housing needs. So this means that housing should not be dependent on anything, not on ability to work, not on access to economic resources, not on like the shape or form of style of your familial or social arrangements. All people deserve housing at all times. And this isn't just like an abstract principle, but we need housing. We need it to live. Living without housing, and you talk about this in my earlier work, living without housing literally shortens our lives. Living without housing kills people. So we need housing to live, and of course we also need housing to do more than just to survive. We need housing to pursue everything else that makes for a fulfilling and happy life. Creative work, political work, social time with loved ones, respite from the world. So we need housing to be our full and our complete selves. And so for me, the concept of housing justice is meant to articulate a commitment to that for, again, all people at all times. And I'm thinking about this a little bit in tension with a rights framework or the concept of a right to housing. And so I want to say that, of course, I think fighting for housing protection is important. But I also want to say that just narrowly focusing on changing laws is not enough. And I want a concept of housing justice that's more expansive than just sort of legal advocacy and reform. And there's a few reasons why I want to, again, think about housing rights and also push a little past that. One is that just as we've learned from critical race theory, and I've learned especially from my collaborator, Dean Spade, that the law in the books and the law in practice are two totally different beasts. And changing the law isn't enough to change material conditions. Another concern I have with just sort of thinking about housing in terms of rights is that legal reform around housing has actually been used to undermine and exhaust radical housing movements by channeling them into legal channels. So a good example of this, I think where I first learned about it, is looking at the case of Puerto Rico and the US colonial government in Puerto Rico. In the late 1960s and early 1970s, there was these sort of expanses of state-owned land that were intended to be sort of released to Puerto Ricans. But of course, that was happening in slow and incomplete ways. And so there was a sort of mass squatting movement that emerged in Puerto Rico with people claiming this land and living on it, and then fighting to be able to stay on that land. And one of the responses of the state as they engaged in violent practices of evicting squatters from this land was to set up legal services to provide lawyers for people to defend themselves against the eviction that the state itself was putting in place. So with one hand, the state is evicting you, and with the other hand, it's offering you free legal services. And this was done as a way to individuate people's experiences. So rather than seeing themselves as a mass movement, and there was a recognition in this movement that what they needed was mass level of action, but then people became individual plaintiffs in individual cases with their own advocates. So it effectively sort of channeling people to the legal system has been a mechanism for breaking up mass movements. It can also pit people against each other as they fight for their own sort of ability to stay, sometimes at the expense of others. And then that's sort of like the third sort of concern I have with thinking just about housing in terms of rights, or what I want to say is that I think just calling for more state funding for forms of subsidized housing is not enough. And it's especially not enough outside of a context of abolition, because the history of public housing in the United States is a history of social control. Public housing in the US has functioned as a mechanism for social control, especially the regulation of black families and the movement of black people through cities. And so we have to think about things like public housing as part of the carceral state, as part of a carceral continuum. And so this is why rather than say we have a right to housing, I prefer to say we all deserve housing. I don't know, there might be other ways to articulate that, but that's the way I'm kind of thinking about it right now. So I want to be making a political and an ethical claim about a collective commitment to housing for all. And then I think from within that commitment, we can do rights work. We can fight for laws that protect tenants and mechanisms for enforcing those laws. But rather than legal reform leading our movements, it's embedded within this broader social commitment. And then the other thing I want to say about what I think in terms of what housing justice work looks like is in response to that kind of lesson from critiques of legal reform movements, is that we need to and I want to resist the sort of individualized experience of housing and the way that housing movements have kind of been fractured by different kinds of housing. So people living in private market housing, working on their issues, people living in public housing, working in their issues, people living in shelter systems on theirs. The fact is that we all live within one system of housing. We experience it very differently. We experience it differently in terms of race and class. And those different experiences are very consequential. But the truth is it's one system that often pits us against each other. In my other work, I describe this borrowing from some anarchist theorists I like as the housing monster, right? And so it's a monster that wants to consume all of us. And in my earlier work, looking at the sort of production of homeless services and categories of regulation around homelessness in the United States, we can really see that in particular, people living without shelter have often been left behind by even like far left progressive tenants' rights movements. And so housing justice, like other racial justice movements, demands that we start with people who are most vulnerable within a system. And we know that if we can provide secure, safe, stable housing for people who are living without shelter, then we're putting something in place that can house all of us. And so then the last thing that I want to say to just sort of wrap this up, this first part up, is that the ground for this, for my analysis of housing justice, and I think for the sort of work that's gathered under the category of prison abolition, sort of theorizing activism, is that U.S. housing in the United States is organized first and foremost through racial capitalism. And so our analysis of what housing justice looks like has to be a critique of not just capitalism, but of racial capitalism. And so as Cedric Robinson, in his engagement with Black radical tradition, has theorized it, racial capitalism draws our attention to at least two things. One is a long history of processes of racialization and racialized subordination that preceded and helped form a context for the emergence of capitalism in Europe. And the second is that capitalism, far from simply forming a unified or single class position of worker has always produced differentiation and hierarchies. And it's done that especially through systems of race. And so we see that when we look at these different forms of housing, and we look at the way that the people within that housing have been disarticulated in their experiences from each other. So to do housing justice work, it must be embedded within larger movements for racial justice, and we must recognize that within racial capitalism, housing has been turned into a mechanism for reproducing racialized subordination. So housing is a form of reproducing racial subordination in the US. And what we want to do is we want to claim housing. We want to take it back from that, and instead we want to make housing a home base for dismantling white supremacy in all of its forms, including its economic forms. So I'll stop with this here, and then I'm going to pass back to Christina, who will tell us some more about her own research, and then I'll talk some more about mine. Thanks.
I appreciate all those comments, and I look forward to having a conversation with you and Q&A about a lot of this. But your comments on racial capitalism are really helpful. It actually transitions really nicely to something that I want to start thinking about. You know, I come to a lot of prison work after doing work for a long time on housing, and this is something that I'm actually not going to talk too much about today, but hopefully we can address in Q&A. Given the talk across the street and the kind of, you know, renewed fight against fascism in this country, I really thought about this event and the kind of questions before us within the broader question of what the function of education is now, and why is it that these fascists keep wanting to you know, fight in universities and in colleges for this space. And so, you know, in his book, Ebony and Ivy, how many people have ever read Craig Stephen Wilder's Ebony and Ivy? Another good book. In Ebony and Ivy, Craig Stephen Wilder describes how the modern university in the US functioned to train elites to reproduce class relations and to run the economy. In that time, Columbia University, which was originally called King's College, in the time that it came into being, the economy was driven by slavery, by the expropriation of indigenous lands, by the expansion and support of colonial rule, and by the exploitation of immigrant labor. So being trained for the economy meant being tutored into a set of understandings about places, about people, about what constituted legitimate and illegitimate ownership of land, and also differentiating what groups of people were able versus unable to govern themselves. He describes how the seemingly objective studies of math, science, economics, and trade were all encoded with a set of racialized conceptions of the world. School was meant to naturalize brutality and misery. And whatever hesitations that students might have had about the barbarism of slavery, native genocide, or colonialism, they were allayed by comforting notions that such institutions were born out of benevolence and an intention to expand civilization. So colleges were necessarily places where people were vocationally and also culturally trained to join the ranks of the plantocracy or to support it, and this meant unequivocally that they were educated into a capitalist ideology of white supremacy. So that's what college's original function was. And when I teach Craig Wilder's book on this subject, I always ask my students to reflect on what college is currently designed to do at this moment. What's the function of college? What does this economy need you to become? What uncomfortable truths does it ask you to naturalize, to pacify, to reconcile yourselves to? And what does this have to do with race, crime, housing, and real estate? These are really important questions to ask here in New York City, the capital of global finance, a site of incredible concentrated wealth and incredible concentrations of poverty and despair. This is a place where tens of thousands of people have no place to sleep or are sleeping in some temporary arrangement, like in a car on someone else's couch, or as it often happens, in an abusive relationship in exchange for shelter. At the same time, this is a place where hundreds of thousands of homes sit vacant because there are sources of real estate investment rather than sites where people live. And I think it's important continually that we ground this conversation right where we are in Harlem, in Morningside Heights, where these contradictions couldn't be more vivid. But it was here in New York City that policing methods that structure and maintain these contradictions evolved, and particular policing methods that have been exported both nationally and internationally. And this is part of what Jordan Camp and I tried to understand in our book, Policing the Planet. You saw it before, I'm not gonna dig and pick it up again. And I just wanna talk a little bit about those dynamics right now. Jordan and I began the project before the rise of Black Lives Matter, and we were putting it together with organizers like Patrice Cullors, one of Black Lives Matter's co-organizers and co-visionaries, at the same time that explosions, protests, uprisings were happening in places like Ferguson, Baltimore, New York, Chicago, Los Angeles, et cetera, et cetera. And even though we and the scholars and the organizers and the artists that we were talking to were all grappling with the deaths of so many people at the hands of police, we were not just interested in how people died as a result of policing. We wanted to make sense of how people were being forced to live under it. So we opened the book with the story of Eric Garner, which I'm sure everybody in this room is familiar with. Before he told officers, "I can't breathe," as he was strangled to death on a Staten Island sidewalk, he said to them as they approached, "This stops today." Like so many people, Eric Garner lived his life on the brink of uncertainty. His death followed years of incessant harassment for small-scale infractions, such as the sale of loose, untaxed cigarettes. He was regularly stopped and searched and violated by police in public. So was Philando Castile, who was stopped nearly 50 times for small things like having a broken taillight. So was Alton Sterling, killed after being stopped for selling bootleg CDs and DVDs, survival economies. So were the women who were stopped, stalked, abused, and raped by Officer Daniel Holtzclaw in Oklahoma. We understand this form of policing to be called broken windows policing, the aggressive policing of small crimes in the purported effort to prevent larger ones. This intense form of policing of crimes of poverty makes everyone, especially in Black, Latinx, Native, mostly immigrant, poor, and working class neighborhoods, criminally suspect, and it's the subject of our book. Let me say a few things about broken windows policing. You can tell I'm a teacher, I'm big on definitions, so here's broken windows policing. So police in the United States, as everybody knows, have historically had a limited range of formal discretionary powers with which they can stop, question, frisk, cite, or arrest anybody they deem to be a source of disorder. These formal powers have evolved over time through measures like vagrancy and loitering laws, black codes, and other forms of banishment aimed at purported sex workers. Broken windows policing, also known as order maintenance policing, emerged as a political response to the urban uprisings of the 1960s and 70s. It was popularized in a 1982 article in the Atlantic magazine by Manhattan Institute pundits. This debunked theory concluded that the best way for police to prevent major crimes was for them to maintain visible signs of order in community. The central metaphor describes an unaddressed, so imagine it with me, an unaddressed broken window in a neighborhood, and that as signaling neglect and encouraging small crimes like litter, graffiti, panhandling, which then lead to larger ones like rape, assault, homicide, and then murder, and then the end of the world. You understand, there's a teleology here. So under broken windows policing, police are charged to regulate what are known as quality of life violations. These are things like loitering, trespassing, having a broken taillight, selling untaxed loose cigarettes, playing loud music, etc. These are crimes of poverty, or to be more specific, behavior that poor and working class people don't uniquely engage in. Wealthy people do all of these things too, but that poor and working class people are disproportionately targeted for. But by expanding police capacity from responding to crimes, to preempting major crimes, broken windows policing constituted a dramatic shift in the legal functioning of police. Let me just say a little bit more about broken windows policing. Broken windows draws upon earlier discursive practices that naturalized urban blight as a product of individual behavior rather than government policies of abandonment. It dissimulates police power relations in a similar manner. The seemingly innocuous transition from spatial metaphor to behavioral assessment is replete with a lot of biologized geographic assumptions. In the metaphor of broken windows, the landscape is presumed to visually communicate social control or the lack thereof, like a patient bearing symptoms. Criminals are imagined as exterior forces, singularly driven in their quest to infect spaces with greater crimes. I just want you to get in your head that this is an imagined ecology that's both highly local and also non-specific. The pathology of spatialized disorder can be grafted on to any street, in any place, at any time. And in this pseudoscientific presentation, the police appear to uniquely possess expertise to diagnose and treat symptoms of disorder that are embedded in the landscape. It's worth remembering that police are not doctors, landscapes are not diseased bodies, and crime is not a pathogen, but a transgression of the law. Crimes change and laws change, as Ruth Gilmore notes, quote, depending on what in a social order counts as stability and who in a social order needs to be controlled. And we know from US history that this changes all the time. Crime, order, and safety are unfixed, contested terms whose definitions shift. And as the life of broken windows has shown, there is great danger in fixing notions of crime and order, just as there is great danger in basing policy on a metaphor. I've got a lot more to say about that. Again, time constraints. But let me say this too. While our book deals with both the specific practice of broken windows policing, it also explores the more general idea that the police have become the catch-all solution to our social problems. So when we talk about police assaults and killings, we're also intended to the ways these circumstances are structured. Many chapters in the book ask why policing and prisons occupy such large, disproportionate parts of our local city, state, and national budgets, while funding for so many other social goods like housing, like education, like healthcare, like transportation, like mental health, are slashed. And one way that we think about these things together is through the recent uprising in Baltimore. We feature a chapter by the journalist Anjali Kamat, who describes the death of Freddie Gray and the subsequent uprising in that city. Freddie Gray's death was ruled a homicide, but none of the police that were involved in his killing were convicted of his murder, a ruling which essentially concluded that Freddie Gray had broke his own neck. So who's responsible for Gray's death? In a practice common in the city of Baltimore, Gray was given what was called a rough ride. This means he was driven without seatbelts, without any restraints, in the back of a police van over the bumpy, unpaved roads of Baltimore, thrashing him against the walls of that van until his spine was severed. This common form of torture encapsulates the processes whereby the industrialized punishment of policing meets the organized abandonment of neoliberalism, to use Ruth Gilmore's rich categories. So indeed, we argue Freddie Gray was killed both by the police and by the city itself. We argue that broken windows has normalized a shift in state capacities away from the production of social goods and towards the security concerns produced in their absence. Under this arrangement, the police can effectively function in an array of roles, such as mental health facilitators, school disciplinarians, public housing managers, and guards against park trespassing. In some municipalities, the police also aggressively function as surrogate tax collectors, or quote-unquote revenue generators, as the Department of Justice investigation into the Ferguson Police Department concluded. Unless we forget, Akai Gurley was assassinated in New York City by officers charged with patrolling public housing projects. 12-year-old Tamir Rice was killed by police charged with securing a public park, and Eric Garner was strangled to death by police regulating a public street for the sale of untaxed commodities. When your only tool is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail. This is the common sense of broken windows policing. This is what has been exported nationally and internationally, and this, we argue, constitutes the policing of the planet. I'm going to say one thing, and then I will actually shut up. In speaking to organizers, writers, artists, scholar activists, to put this book together, Jordan and I were really challenged to think together things that have been customarily and traditionally thought apart. We had to ask, what does broken windows policing mean, not only in an age of mass incarceration, but in an era of mass deportation, when Muslim communities are under unprecedented surveillance and infiltration, when Native people are being killed at incredible rates, when the bodies of queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people are under assault, especially poor and working class queer, trans, and gender nonconforming people of color, when people are punished for having to live on the streets, in their cars, or in public space, at this moment when we even have to assert that Black Lives Matter, when unemployment is high and public money is being spent on prisons, permanent war, and policing, and at this time when our security expertise is being exported around the planet from London, San Salvador, Kabul, and beyond. I think we're challenged to imagine a robust solidarity in this decisive moment when it's arguably more important than ever. These are the questions before us, and I'm really grateful to be here in conversation with serious-minded people who are looking collectively for an answer. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, that was so helpful. And I think I think what we planned is working, which is nice. So I'm gonna turn to talk about some of my recent work that's really responding to the work of Policing the Planet, and really trying to look at, in some specific material ways, relationships between dynamics of policing and gentrification and displacement. So what I'll talk today about is, for my last comments, is looking in particular at a neighborhood in Los Angeles, Echo Park, and the specific strategies of policing being rolled out there today. And in some ways what I'm thinking about when I'm looking at the relationship of policing and gentrification, I'm drawing from the work of Neil Smith, a geographer who really helped us give us a kind of theoretical and historical model for understanding gentrification. And one of the key insights of Smith's work is that Smith recognizes that disinvestment is a step or a stage of gentrification. So a period of time when the state and private and capital are withdrawing resources, that this is actually the beginning of gentrification, because what that's producing is vulnerability to future speculation and investment. So as property values are driven down through disinvestment, the potential in 10 or 15 years of making money actually grows, right? When things are worth less, then the potential to make more as neighborhoods around that area gentrify increases. And so this is a really key insight. This leads us to recognize that actually resistance to gentrification has to start before the new condos are being constructed or the coffee shops start to open. It has to start at the moment, at the period or phase of disinvestment. So what I'm thinking about here is policing as a method of disinvestment. And my understanding of this really evolved out of a free class that I got to help teach in 2013 at the Los Angeles Liberation School. Emma Heaney, who's here, is one of the organizers of that. And it was this really amazing opportunity for me to get to spend a couple weeks with activists and organizers thinking about exactly the kind of questions that we're looking at today. And then I was able to do another version of that course with a group of housing organizers in Washington, D.C. And it's really through those collaborative experiences that I've begun to kind of develop this way of thinking about policing as a piece of disinvestment. And so again, what that means is fighting against policing and incarceration is a form of struggling for housing justice. It's a way to secure people in the neighborhoods that they live in. So I'm gonna give you some background on Echo Park, and then a little history of gang injunctions, and then looking at what gang injunctions look like in Echo Park. Echo Park has been a long time predominantly working class community in LA. It has one of the highest densities in Los Angeles. About estimates of 40% of people living in Echo Park today are of Mexican origin. It had in 2008 a median household income of $38,000, which was below the overall median income of $42,000 in LA. If you've been, so Echo Park has a sort of human-made lake in the middle and a park around it. This was originally built as a reservoir by the city of Los Angeles in 1868. And when this reservoir was built, then real estate speculators kind of came in and bought all the land around it, anticipating opportunities for development. But problem those speculators encountered was that Los Angeles had the right to overflow the reservoir, actually, in part of its management. So this, of course, immediately drove down the value of that land. And so there was a long sort of back and forth legal battle between those landowners and the city, and it was finally settled in 1891. And so city leaders struck a deal with the men who owned this land around the reservoir. And those speculators gave up 33 acres of the land that they owned, turned it over to the city so it could be turned into a park. And in exchange for that, the city agreed that it wouldn't overflow the reservoir. And so this had a pretty immediate effect of driving up property values, and it helped spark the commercial development along Sunset Drive, which runs to the north of that area today. So Echo Park as a park was opened up in 1895, and there was a sort of flurry of development in the 1920s around that park. In the late 1940s or 1950, in the period of urban renewal, which went around destroying neighborhoods all around the United States, there was a highway constructed that basically cut off part of the park from itself. And then in the few years following that, 2 different trolley companies that provided transportation to the park stopped running service there. So this is a part of the history of privatization of transportation in California and Los Angeles. And so during this period of time, then Echo Park enters a period of neglect and this sort of beginnings of the stage of disinvestment. So the housing stock is sort of left to deteriorate, older homes are demolished, cheaper structures are built, and this is when waves of Mexican immigrants in search of affordable housing start to move into Echo Park. And if you look at the sort of popular and media narratives of the park from the 1920s to today, you see these kind of shifts back and forth between an idea of the park as offering a kind of green, haven in the midst of hectic city life. This in some ways is kind of a corollary to the biological discourses that you were pointing to. So it's the city is supposed to the city is supposed to build parks to have a civilizing effect, right, on the residents. And so you see that sort of narrative in early news coverage of the 1920s. But then by 1971, a piece published in the Los Angeles Times was titled "Which Way for Echo Park: Inner City Oasis or Slum?" So it's starting to have this kind of debate about, is this decline irreparable or can it be sort of reclaimed? Echo Park then goes through mass gentrification, which I'll look at in more detail in a little bit. And then in 2013, at the time that I was doing this project with the Los Angeles Liberation School, the park surrounding Echo Park Lake was reopened after a 2-year, $45 million renovation. And that renovation involved draining and refortifying the lake, new landscaping, and new recreational facilities. And if you look at the media coverage of that, you see sort of the echoes of both this kind of notion of the park as having a civilizing effect and a sort of racist but race-neutral discourse about the dangers of Echo Park. And this is kind of, again, Neil Smith's notion of the revanchist city. It's an opportunity to enact revenge on the poor people who are blamed for the conditions they live in rather than the sort of structural forces that produced it. So, for example, KTLA, a local news program, when the park was reopened after this 2-year renovation, said this: during the project, the LA Department of Public Works drained the lake so crews could remove the overgrown algae and trash that residents dumped, including skateboards, 3 guns, furniture, and a toilet. However, no bodies were found. And this thing about no bodies being found when the lake was drained is what you heard from people all over the city when they were talking about this. So there was this, and that is a stand-in for some notion of criminalized gang activity in Echo Park. So we're supposed to be shocked that the lake isn't full of dead bodies that have been deposited there. In the same month that the park was reopened, the city announced a new proposed gang injunction. So I'll say more about technically what a gang injunction is in just a moment, but for now, just it's a civil order a gang injunction is a civil order that limits behaviors within a specified area for anyone named on the injunction. So I'll go into more detail in a moment, but that's sort of enough for now. I want to give you a quick kind of history of gang injunctions in Los Angeles and California. And here I'm really drawing from the work of sociologist Anna Muniz, who's been really key in drawing our attention to this. So the first gang injunction was put in place in Los Angeles in 1987 in a neighborhood called Cadillac Corning at the time, and now called La Cienega Heights, I think. And so we look at that because it provides a little model of what gang injunctions have looked like all over LA and then all over California. In the time prior to 1987, prior to the placement of this gang injunction, this neighborhood of Cadillac Corning went through a dramatic demographic shift, which was a result of the desegregation of public schools in California. So black families began relocating to Cadillac Corning to access these schools. And then we had processes of what people call white flight setting in. So in 1970, that neighborhood was 98% white. 10 years later, in 1980, it was 25% white. And by 1990, it was just 19% white. So in a 20-year period, we have like almost a total evacuation of white people from this neighborhood. But what's important to note also is that the surrounding neighborhoods remained predominantly white. And this is another sort of key piece of identifying like where injunctions wind up. It's also worth noting that at the time, the LAPD ranks sort of districts based on like sort of rates of homicide and aggravated assaults. Now, those are categories that we want to think critically about, but what I want to note here is that even by the LAPD's own rubrics, Cadillac Corning at the time, 1987, was ranked amongst the lowest. So by their own calculation of violence and danger, Cadillac Corning was ranked quite low. So other things happening at that time, in 87, we got the beginnings of a database system, what later got named CalGang, which is a California-wide database of people affiliated with gangs. In 1988, the injunction movement went statewide, so it traveled from LA to California with the STEP Act, which stands for Street Terrorism Enforcement and Prevention Act. And this law was the first US law to define a gang, and it made belonging to a gang itself a criminal act. And then it also allows for like gang enhancements of prison sentences, so the same crime committed by somebody who's affiliated with a gang then carries a higher sentence. It also puts gangs in the category of terrorist organizations. So it puts them in the whole context of everything post-September 11th. The STEP Act then like funneled all these funds to LA County for it to expand its own injunction work and its own database operations. Of course, there was resistance to injunctions from the beginning. In 1995, Court of Appeals ruled that only criminal activity could be prohibited by an injunction. Why that matters will make more sense in a moment. But this ruling was overturned in 1997. At least a dozen cities across California are using gang injunctions today. And in LA, there's at least 46 injunctions that cover at least 72 neighborhoods. So some of them are quite big. Okay, so with that sort of historical background in mind, I can let you know what an injunction is. So the first thing to know about it is that it's a civil court order. So it comes not through criminal courts, but through civil courts. So gang injunctions operate on precedents of public nuisance abatements. So a lot of the same things rolled out around like quality of life policing. So this is like a noise complaint or something like that. A gang injunction establishes what's called a safety zone in which the injunction operates. And when the injunction first goes into place, it names specific individuals as gang members, and then in turn, it limits their activities. So in California, anyone named on a gang injunction is entered in this CalGang database. When an injunction first goes into place, it'll have the list of these, it'll target like specific gangs, so it'll name those gangs, and then specific members who have been linked to those gangs. And so the injunction will have lists of names of people that the injunction applies to. Importantly, an injunction will also have hundreds of John Does listed. And what this allows for is for names to be added to the injunction. These names are added to an injunction solely on the basis of police observation. So there's a set of criteria for being labeled a gang member, again, for the purpose of an injunction. So I'm gonna name those for you now. So one would be an individual admits gang membership. An individual is observed regularly associating with known gang members. An individual has gang tattoos. An individual wears gang clothing or symbols. An individual is in a photo with known gang members or is using gang signs in a photo. The individual is named in a gang document or gang-related graffiti. The individual is named as a gang member by a reliable source. The individual corresponds with known gang people identified as gang members or as associates of gang members. The individual corresponds with known gang members or writes or receives correspondence about gang activities. The individual produces any graffiti about gangs on walls, books, or paper. So as you can already tell, these criteria, like what constitutes a gang sign, what constitutes gang clothing, what constitutes not just a gang member but an associate. So these are the criteria. The way this is applied, an individual has to meet 2, and only 2 of this criteria, and that has to be observed by any police officer. So any police officer can say, you're wearing this color, and you're with this person who knows somebody who's in a gang, and now you can be entered into this injunction. So now you take the place of one of these John Does. Not until 2007, so what is that, 20 years after the first injunction was put in place, was a process even established for getting removed from an injunction. So prior to that, there was no way to get your name off of an injunction. This is a process that takes like 6 to 9 months. And to get your name off of an injunction, you have to have had no contact with police for 2 years prior. So as you can imagine, it's basically impossible to get your name off of an injunction. And the last data that I had was from 2012, and 9 people had gotten their names removed from an injunction. Very recently, a class action lawsuit was settled that Caitlin Noss alerted me to. And it has mechanisms for removal that will apply to about 5,000 people currently named in injunctions. So once you're identified as a member of a gang against which there's an injunction, and you're in an area defined by the injunction, what would otherwise be legal activities become illegal. So examples of that would be being in public with someone else named in the injunction, being outside after an injunction-stated curfew, carrying a pager from the 80s, or a cell phone, okay? So these behaviors that are otherwise legal within that area become illegal only for people named on that injunction. So there's an organization in Los Angeles that's been doing amazing work around this, the Youth Justice Coalition, and they say that we can think of gang injunctions as a kind of restraining order applied to a group. So I think this is helpful. I think we also could think of it as a kind of martial law that's selectively applied, because it's onto a specific territory, but it only applies to some people within that territory. Any violation of an injunction, so for example, being out after curfew, is punishable by up to 6 months in jail or a juvenile facility. Now, the fact that injunctions are civil and not criminal law is incredibly important. Organizers and activists have fought, as we dismantle the prison system, have fought for ways to help people survive when they're caught up in the carceral state and its forces. Those are guarantees for people in criminal courts, and none of those guarantees apply to people in civil courts. So you being named an injunction, you have no legal right to be notified. So you do not have to be told that you're on an injunction, and so now there's a curfew that applies to you. You have no right to defend yourselves in court before the injunction goes into place, and you have no right to free legal defense. So in sort of circumventing criminal courts and doing this through civil courts, they found a way to sort of like produce a dragnet that people don't even know they're being targeted by, and have no mechanism before it goes into effect of trying to stop. So YJC, the Youth Justice Coalition, has shown in their work, so they've produced some reports tracking this, that gang injunctions in California have clearly followed the patterns established by that first case in 1987 in Cadillac Corning. So injunctions have been put in place not in areas of highest crime rates, and again, that's according to the LAPD, or greatest concentration of like what the state recognizes as violent crimes, but where they've gone into places where there are demographic shifts taking place in terms of race and patterns in gentrification. So as YJC writes in their report, gang injunctions have been used not when communities were suffering the highest levels of violence, but when communities were either being gentrified, experiencing increasing property values, and or were bordered by majority white and economically wealthier communities, which is what we saw in that first case. So we can see this exactly with the case of Echo Park. Echo Park today, according to these sort of police stats, is experiencing the lowest homicide rate in 30 years. Echo Park's white population has increased by as much as 17% from 1990 to 2011. And that number, 17%, may not sound that great, but this is actually in a period of overall decline of the white population of Los Angeles County. So Los Angeles County's white population declined over 40%, from 40% to 28% in that same period of time. So relative to overall, this is quite a significant shift. So if gang injunctions go into neighborhoods that actually are already experiencing state-recognized declines in violent crime, how are they justified? How does this come to be? And so what I want to say, and I'll sort of start to wrap up here, is that gang injunctions are animated by and gain support through a racialized discourse of safety. And this discourse substitutes white feelings and plays off of white feelings of danger and attends to those rather than the actual experiences of violence and harm among communities of color. So an easy example of this, in the sort of order for the gang injunction, the gang injunctions are put forth by city attorneys. In the order for the gang injunction, the city attorney wrote, our residents have the right to enjoy all our public areas, including Echo Park, free of gang crime and intimidation. This injunction will be an important tool in curbing the escalating criminal activity of these 6 rival gangs and bringing needed peace to our neighborhoods. So all of that is literal lies that flies in the face of what's actually happening in that city. But you know, the residents we know does not mean the residents of color who are being displaced. And this gang crime and intimidation are intentionally vague to sort of stoke white fears, right? And to sort of pitch injunctions as a response to those. So in some ways, I think we can really see, and Anna Muniz and her work and Gary Stewart have said this as well, we can really see the black codes as historical precedent to gang injunctions. Black codes were passed during Reconstruction by the southern states in 1865, 66, and they aimed at limiting African-American occupational, social, and geographical mobility. They were named black codes by those opposing them, right? So like injunctions, they criminalized what was otherwise legal activity, so it was like things like loitering or being out when you didn't have a job. And they didn't name a racial category, but the intentions, the intended targets were clear, and the effects were clear as well. You know, and as Angela Davis has shown us, this period of time really transforms jails and prisons in the US into a mechanism for controlling and subjugating putatively free black populations. And when I want to sort of add to the analysis of others who have linked gang injunctions to black codes is to recognize the specific sort of discourses around gender and sexuality that, again, I say like sort of animate this idea of safety. And we see this in another city attorney who was quoted in an article about injunctions. He says, the gang injunction is a tool. He says it's not the tool, but it's a tool in the city's effort to try to curtail gang violence. He goes on, if folks are not hanging out as much, bad things happen less, to put it in very basic terms. So again, and this is like, you know, prior to Trump's, you know, bad hombres, but it's to the same effect, right? It's a sort of very vague and intentionally vague evocation of the sort of supposedly threatening populations lurking about. In an interview that I conducted with a prison abolition activist who's been working with YJC, they spoke directly to this sort of like this notion of bad things and hanging out. And that activist told me, quote, what's seen as a threat is a certain kind of masculinity and a certain sociality, men of color talking to each other in the street. A racialized threat is evoked by lawmakers in the attorney's office with this image. It is used to create a story which is justified by feelings of safety versus an actual understanding of how violence operates in people's lives. And we can see this absolutely when we look at the effects of like what the material broad effects of gang injunctions across California. Looking at only back in 2012, YJC has conducted a study of the CalGang database, and they found that about 95% of people in the database were male, 20% were African American, of about a 6-7% part of the population, 66% of people in the database were Latino, of about 38% of the population. And this number, I think, is again where we can really see the historical lineage to the black codes, and this is in Anna Muniz's research. In 2003, if you take African American men in LA County between the ages of 21 and 24, 47% were in the CalGang database. Half of black men between the ages of 21 and 24 were in this database. In effect, what injunctions do is they make life unlivable for those that they target. And this is young men of color who are not just criminalized, but are spatially displaced. And so, just to conclude, we need to refuse these terms of safety and violence, and this is, I think, part of the work, again, of linking housing to abolition work. And this has really been the work of women of color, theorists and activists who, especially working out of like the anti-violence work, who've really, on the one hand, asked us to move away from our reliance on the state, move away from 911 as like what we do, but have also drawn our attention to the specific gendered and sexual dynamics of these forms of policing. So the gang injunction, in effect, produces the opposite of what it claims. It produces less safety. It produces more instability, right? but it's instability and lack of safety for poor people of color, right? And so when we value those lives, we see that injunctions, again, they're claiming an inverted reality. They increase the harms, they increase social and economic marginalization. And so any activism around gentrification and housing has to start from looking at this relationship of policing and to these specific sort of gendered and sexual sort of discourses around what safety is and safe for whom. Okay, thank you.
I'm going to let Craig catch his breath for a second. So we'd love to take some questions from the audience. We might take a few and then answer it at once.
What is the role of an attorney who represents you in terms of the larger picture? Are they just simply to defend the person? Do they see the fallout in terms of society, whether their legal unions are agitating for change, because they are at the center of it?
I'm interested in your response to the current events. Well, they weren't current, but a while back, there was some gang-related activity in the public housing complexes. One, if the injunctions actually exist in New York, but two, it seemed, if it did, it resulted in one of the largest gang-related activities, and they rounded everybody up. So I'm just interested to know what your response to this when you talk about abolition and housing and gangs, specifically right around the corner from where we are now.
Hi, I'm curious to get your thoughts around the role of the university in destabilizing access to quality housing, thinking about Columbia University right across the way, using eminent domain to move into the west side of Harlem and take over public housing to be used for students and whatever needs. So I'm just curious if your research touches into that and speaking to that.
I'll start with the easiest ones in the sense that I won't be able to satisfyingly answer your question. We can move to some other ones. So they do exist in other states. I think Colorado is doing injunctions, a few other states, but I actually don't know the full extent of where that's been rolled out. I don't know if you have any sense of that or if somebody else in the room might. The way that my understanding is that the way, I'm not a legal scholar, although I'm trying to understand this, that the due process protections are circumnavigated is because this is civil and not criminal. But I don't know. So like for example, the class action lawsuit has been able to, what is actually targeted, this one that just was one that's provided some mechanisms for getting your name removed, is it's taken on just the aspect of curfew. And so this is one of the ones that like there's sort of been debate about if like curfew can be applied to specific people. And so they were able to successfully argue that this curfew in this injunction was a violation. And so people within that injunction who were caught being out after curfew now have some forms of redress. So this is the way that people are sort of fighting it, but it winds up being sort of after the fact, because that's the way the injunction has been designed, so that it's something that, again, you're not notified when you're put on it, you're not given free legal defense, and you can't object to your name being on it before it's on it. So it all has to happen after the fact. So I don't know if this is the most, this is what I can kind of say about that right now. And maybe I'll say, what else do I want to answer before I pass it back? There's a question about attorneys, there's a question about the university, and there's a question about public housing here. Maybe I'll talk about one more and then, do you want to step in? Okay. I want to say something about the university because we're at a university, so I'll jump to that question, but we'll get back to the others. I mean, that's a key question for us. Universities play a huge role in changing what housing looks like in the cities in which they're located. Actually, one of the places that I learned this really well was a study by Vincent Leon Callow of, his name is Vincent Leon Callow, I can give it to you later if you want, who did a great study of a homeless services organization in Northampton, Massachusetts. And part of what he looks at in his analysis is the impact of Smith College on the housing market and the rental market there. College students will drive up housing prices because they have access to resources that often people who are local to that area don't have. They also become preferable tenants to landlords who have ideas about students versus like locals, for example. They also come and go. And when people come and go from neighborhoods, that has a huge destabilizing effect, and it gives the opportunity for rents to be continually increased. And I thought his study was really helpful because it's taking this very small place where you can see it really well. You know, New York is vast, and so of course there's like lots of things playing a role in sort of strangling people's access to housing. But you know, universities have often like historically not seen themselves as having obligations to the neighborhoods, you know, or responsibilities to the neighborhoods in which they're located. And then sometimes when they recognize those obligations, it backfires. So like in University of Pennsylvania, which is in like a historically working class and black neighborhood in Philadelphia, decided to sort of pay back. It would open a sort of basically like a charter school, so like provide like all these resources for a school. So what's happened? There's been a massive influx to this neighborhood of white people with lots of money who want their kids to go for free to the school, right? And so it's accelerated the mechanisms that were already in place there. So, yeah.
And I'll just pick up right there because I think that's exactly the right question. You know, in 2005, I used to teach at Barnard College, and we did a whole unit about gentrification in Columbia University. And so now I'm here. I'm trying to understand what that means. But, you know, I'd echo everything that Craig said, and I want to also say that as part of the New Directions in American Studies, we are going to be working with BCRW to organize a conference about housing in Harlem, and I'm not sure if you're a student here or have any interest, but I'd love to think about that with you. And I think that's actually related to the question about the gang raids that happen in public housing. Again, I'm new to the area, and I don't want to speak as an expert, but I do know that people like a local reporter named Raven Rakia and an organizer named Josmar Trujillo have been talking a lot about the gang raids in very similar terms that Craig laid out for us, which is to say that the pretext upon which people have been determined to be a part of gangs or gang affiliates, you know, like whether or not they had pictures online, Facebook friends that counted, indicated that they were so-called members of a gang, were really flimsy and you know, resulted in one of the largest raids in public housing in recent recent New York history, and I think are certainly part and parcel of the exact same process of intensifying criminalization in an effort to displace you know, people from public housing and from low-income housing, precisely because, as I mentioned before, the property value of that housing has gone up so high. I wanted to just say one other thing about gang injunctions and the kind of profiling that Craig was talking about that I think you're gesturing towards in your question. And that's, you know, it's important to remember that Black Lives Matter, as much as it came into being as a result of, you know, spread across the country as there were killings of Black people by police. It started as a response to the non-indictment of George Zimmerman after the killing of Trayvon Martin. And it started with the outrage that a man could self-deputize himself to be judge, jury, and executioner of a young Black boy doing essentially everything that Craig laid out, determining that because he was Black, because he was wearing a hoodie, and because he was in a gated community where ostensibly he had no right to be even though he lived there, that therefore he constituted a threat and could be assassinated. That's the outrage that fueled Black Lives Matter, and that's important to remember. We have a contributor to our book. He closes out he writes the final chapter. His name is Vijay Prashad. And elsewhere, Vijay has written very provocatively about how, he's got an article called George Zimmerman, Human Drone. And he really thinks across scales about how this same logic of gang injunctions, of profiling young people of color congregating as being a threat, is the exact same logic being used in the war on terror. It's something that Jordan and I tried to do throughout the book. We have several interviews with anti-war activists, organizers against Islamophobia, to really think about how these logics mutually reinforce each other, not just in New York City and across the country, but around the world. Oh, let's take more questions. Are we doing okay for time? Or go ahead. Do you want to say something?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe I'll quickly and then,
Yeah, sure.
so just like thinking about public housing, this is also a great perfect example of the sort of dynamics that Christina was talking about earlier in terms of this kind of, what's at time been like kind of biological and then sort of folds into a cultural discourse that assigns disorder to racialized populations and sort of ascribes it to them as like an inherent quality of them. And we can see this in the history of public housing in the United States. And there's a great documentary about the Pruitt-Igoe housing in St. Louis that does this really well for us, that shows us that, it was like a modernist experiment in sort of like the dream of like the power of the state to massively expand sort of housing in this really sort of rapid way that had no sort of sensitivities actually to like sort of actual existing needs and forms of community. And they built these giant towers, so this is like sort of they're quite famous because they were also among the early ones to be demolished. They built these massive towers for public housing. They recruited black families from rural communities, brought them away from those communities, sort of took those communities apart, placed them in this housing experiment into buildings that cost, I don't know what at the time, these massive budgets for building them with no budgets for maintenance. So literally didn't build into the budgets how to maintain these buildings. So of course, they quickly deteriorate. People don't want to live there in these deteriorating conditions. The people are now half living in these buildings. They're half abandoned. And then we get a discourse that the problem with public housing is the people living in housing, they're going to destroy that housing. They can't maintain this housing. They're going to introduce disorder. And so structurally, we produce something that creates exactly that narrative that then allows for the solution to be blowing up all of this housing and like now dispersing these populations that have been cut off again from the communities and the community ties that they had prior. So you asked a question about attorneys and the role of attorneys, I think. Is that right? I think both in the sort of way that I was thinking about housing justice and when we look at people doing on-the-ground abolition work, I think what we're in a really good and productive moment of sort of defining what the roles of lawyers should be in supporting grassroots social movements and what it means to, again, like embed the kind of legal expertise that we need and sort of legal defense work that we need within movements led by people, experiencing the front lines of displacement, gentrification, hyper-policing, and mass incarceration. And this is a little different than like sort of a model we often think of the lawyer of having some kind of special expert knowledge and then being the ones that will lead and tell us. And this is, again, what happened with housing movements in part, is it got channeled into legal arenas like housing courts, and then people become dependent on legal experts. And so I think there's a very important role for lawyers, but it's like, it's inside the movements, and it's in roles being defined by people who are trying to figure out how best to survive as we dismantle these systems or as we produce the kinds of housing that we want.
I completely agree, and I just want to acknowledge that there are some people in this room that are affiliated with the Sylvia Rivera Law Project, that New York has quite a lot of people who are doing that kind of work, who are trying to think within social movements what the role of the law and lawyers can be. And I just want to encourage anybody in this room that's thinking about law school to be mindful about what that relationship might look like in the kinds of works that you're interested in.
So thank you both for all of your insights. So Christina, you touched on this a little bit, but this is a question for both of you. And I kind of wrote down a few notes to keep it short. So we're in a moment of increased precarity and surveillance, and also a moment where the criminalization of the survival economy is really on the rise, and survival economy tactics are being criminalized as well. So with this and the changing nature of work happening across the country and internationally, I'm wondering if that's sort of changed your perspective on your work, and how you think about how your work intersects, both of you.
Thank you both. I have a strategy question that I guess is more for Craig, but is based off of what you were saying earlier, Christina, about redefining terms, and I'm particularly thinking about redefining ownership. And so I'm curious what you think about community land trusts, which is something that like radical housing organizers have been and are working on in New York, including in East Harlem, if you want to ground it somewhere closer to here. As a potentially radical abolitionist strategy for housing organizers, both for the potential to reframe how we think about ownership and community and democracy, but also to tangibly meet the housing needs of people that are otherwise pushed out, whether it's formerly incarcerated folks or other people. But it's also something that is vulnerable to being subsumed by the state and co-opted.
I'm I'm curious, as someone new to the conversation of abolitionism, what you see the relationship as between socialism and abolitionism. So I've been working with a group in the South Bronx that I think has been experiencing similar things as maybe the Echo Park neighborhood, where there's just a lot of over-policing and disinvestment that is, I think, in anticipation of reinvestment. And I'm wondering what they've been seeing in that neighborhood is, since all the stop and frisk organizing that has happened in New York City has you know, in a certain sense shifted police tactics. There's fewer stops and frisks. But the gang raids have really increased. So what they're seeing is there's a shift in police tactics. And I'm wondering if you are seeing that in other places also. I mean, I think we're still seeing broken windows, but I guess it just speaks to how much we can fight so hard. I know there's a chapter in your book, Christina, on the stop and frisk movement in New York, which was really powerful and exciting, but I'm not sure that we're in a much better place now because of this. I mean, I think in terms of building power, we are, but the police tactics being so shape-shifting. And the other question, so I'm just wondering what you think about, I guess it's partly a question about how to think about responding and what we're challenging. And the other question is about zoning. Because I was looking at how zoning and policing, they derive their power from the same part of the Constitution, like the 10th Amendment or something, which has to do with, you know, the states having a right to basically control territory for the so-called betterment or safety, public good. And again, it makes me think there's just so much space for tactics for state power and legal strategies to be used for, you know, essentially to grow racial capitalism. So just how then do we think about a more robust solidarity and organizing? Sorry, that was a long question.
It's a great question. I want to do a time check real quick. Can somebody tell me what time it is? 7:36. Okay, I'm going to try to keep my answers to all of your fascinating and compound questions short, because I meant what I said at the beginning. I do want to be a part of the protest across the street, and I welcome any of you that want to come with me to walk with me. Okay, thanks for handing me the mic first to try to address these questions. You know, I think it's really important to say that, you know, this collaboration that Jordan and I did, along with I think every other collaboration we've worked on together, we've been adamant that we are working in dialogue with social movements because tactics change, conditions change. You know, I think sometimes, especially at moments of powerlessness, you know, like when we have formulas that feel like we have the explanation, the answer to all questions, they can make us feel powerful. But what social movements do is they have to have a very precise read of power, a precise read of the conjuncture of what's unfolding at the moment, and therefore what the terrain of struggle looks like. This shifts constantly. What social movements help us do is understanding how we have to change strategies and tactics accordingly. So you're absolutely right. I mean, you know, yes, we definitely spend a lot of the time talking about explicitly broken windows policing in the social movements that organized against them historically in New York City. We also devote a third of the book to something called community policing, because the particular transformation we saw at the time we were putting the book together was that, you know, there was a vibrant pushback to broken windows policing, and it was getting reiterated as community policing. And here in New York City, it was called neighborhood policing. And so, you know, we have some extraordinary chapters, including Justin Hansford, who was a lawyer who accompanied Mike Brown's family to Geneva, who was actually on President Obama's 21st century presidential task force on policing, who breaks ranks. He says, this is old wine in new bottles. That's how right? Yeah, okay, yeah. I mean, he says this is basically the same thing. We have other interviews where people quote Bratton directly William Bratton, the chief proponent and claims to be the originator of broken windows policing, where he says community policing is basically the same thing as broken windows, just rebranded. So we constantly have to locate their shifting strategies. Our strategies have to shift. The important thing about an abolitionist framework is to say we can't get caught in their shifting strategies. I'll tell you all this for all you undergraduates. My very first day of college, I learned the only thing I needed to know, well, not exactly, but I learned a really important lesson, which is whoever sets the agenda wins the debate. So as long as we're not setting the agenda about what we want or how we want to see society transformed, if we're continually responding to shifts in rhetoric and discourse, we are always chasing, we will always lose. And so this relates to the question that I think you asked earlier, which is a very perceptive question. What's the relationship between abolition and socialism? I don't want to speak for all abolitionists because I think people would have different perspectives. But when I chart a genealogy of abolition from Du Bois to Angela Davis to Ruth Wilson Gilmore, I see this as decisively a socialist tradition. Full stop. I guess the answer. That's the answer to that. Okay, short answer, but let me see if I can start to address this question of survival economy by saying this. I think it's really important to think about broken windows in this city and with this president who made his fortune here on real estate as a developer in New York City. Like most millionaires in this country, Donald Trump, I hate to tell you, did not make his money. He inherited it, and he inherited it from his father, who made his money building affordable housing. Why did he build affordable housing? Not because he was a benevolent man. The man was arrested at Klan rallies and sued multiple times for racial discrimination in housing. He built it because at the time there were subsidies for building affordable housing, right? By the time Donald Trump comes into his own as a developer in the late 70s and early 80s, those subsidies are gone. There's no more incentive to build housing for poor and working class people, and so we have this tacky lifestyles of the rich and famous, Gilded Age Trump of the 80s who was explicitly building housing just for the rich. I think this is important because one of the things we try to describe in the book is how broken windows policing helps usher in a shift to neoliberalism, which means a massive transformation in the economy, not just, as we've talked about before, the elimination of these social wage, public funding for these social wage, but also because you see a massive transformation of the economy from an economy of industrialization to one of deindustrialization, but one where finance and real estate become emergent. Trump rides those waves, and it's so significant that he was, for example, took out that famous full-page ad in the New York Times against the Central Park Five. There are multiple ways that he amplified efforts of racist criminalization because they were tied to the expansion of that real estate and finance economy. That's a very long way of saying I think the question of survival economies, the policing of survival economies is essential, but we have to put it in this long arc of why is it that people have to sell cigarettes loose on the street? Why is it that people are trying to get by selling bootleg DVDs and CDs? What in the broader economic structure is forcing people into survival economies, and how do we stop that and not just stop the policing of those things that people have to do to stay alive?
Thank you. That was, yeah, thank you. I will briefly sort of add in, what do I want to say? Yes to all of that. And, that, of course, gang injunctions reproduce precarity and produce more precarity, right? So not only are those survival economies being targeted by policing, but they're actually being produced then, right? As people are shut out of formal economic, formal labor markets because of things like convictions, just as they are shut out of access to public housing because of a felony conviction, right? So, there's like a feedback loop between these economic systems and these policing systems and these housing systems that again make life unlivable, or that's the goal, right? And people survive within that, but they survive within these sort of like increasingly tight constraints. And then I want to say about, there are probably people in here who can speak better to the community land trusts question. I will say this, like, so the questions that, so I don't know much about this, so we can talk more, you can teach me, but like the sort of questions I want to ask are like related to what Christina was saying about like who's setting the agenda. So what's driving this move? Who are the actors and the offices and the agencies that are like organizing what it's going to look like? How is access and participation being determined? So we could ask that question of any sort of strategy, right? Or any new sort of thing that emerges. So I don't know in this case, but I think, you know, like I learned to ask those questions in sort of my other research about like homeless services in the United States and the ways that housing, so I talk about this in my book, this sort of model of like housing first, which is a form of access to tiered shelter systems with no requirements for things like social services or drug treatment. This is a thing that sort of left progressive housing activists have demanded for a long time. The reason that housing first has become a federal priority is because a bunch of social scientists have determined that it costs cities more money to leave people on the street than it does to put them into housing. That economic argument is not where I want us to place our faith, right? Because that same economic logic can be turned back around, and that's what's happening in cities like Los Angeles, was one of the first cities to experiment with this model. So housing first got kind of taken up by the state, and in a short-term way, it is saving people's lives, and I don't want to be dismissive of that. It's moving people into housing who are living on the street. But it's doing it actually in service of cleaning up those streets so that hotels can be built, so that condos can be built, so that tourists will feel safe, right, wandering around there. And so it's actually shoring up the same system that produces housing insecurity and homelessness in the first place. So I've tried to ask some of those questions there. I think we could ask them about, you know, any of these forms. I mean, it kind of goes back to, I think, what you're asking us to think about in terms of like the flexibility of policing in particular in the state in general to respond to, you know, our movements and adapt around them. But it's what critical race theorists call preservation through transformation, right? But actually to preserve and the state's monopoly on violence or its control over a territory, but just like a different way of demarcating the lines of it. So the question is about, again, back to the sort of where does power reside and how do we shift, you know, that power? And I think we should end.
Yes, but I just want to say, I think it's about 7:45 to 8, so I know people have to stretch. Thank you all for being so patient and coming tonight. I'm going to say in about 10 minutes, I will walk over. If you want to come with me, I would love for you to join me. But thank you all for coming. And
there are snacks before you go.